Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix, and I am going to be commenting for you today. This is the last episode in a series that I'm calling Swamp Castle. I won't actually be reading a short story. It'll be commentary on the last story and the series in general. The episode is going to go into basically three parts. The first one is I'm going to tell a story of why I did this series and why I'm still writing. Then I'm going to do commentary on Unfood. And then, last but not least, I will circle back to commentary on all of the stories that you've heard so far in this series, particularly if you're listening to this in audiobook format. So, the story in question goes back to what is inarguably the worst year of my life, summer of 2011, a year before I meet my current wife. It is a year after I had gotten divorced. I had left the church in 2007, so only a couple years after I did that. Don't want to go too much into the nature of my divorce, but let's just simply say that at the time it was mostly amicable. It was, so long story short, in 2011, in August, I fly out to Reno with nothing but high expectations. For those not familiar, World Con is the oldest, so far as I know anyway, science fiction and fantasy convention. This was the 69th. Since then, I believe it's the 79th year, since that was maybe the 80th. Every year, WorldCon moves from one place to another. For example, DragonCon happens for Atlanta every year. They stay at the same place. Origins, which is the game manufacturer's gaming convention, used to move around, and now it's in the same city every year. It's not as common as it used to be for a con to move around, but WorldCon still does it. When they have the con that year, you vote for the Hugo and the Nebula. Well, I'm sorry, you vote for the Hugo. The Nebula is reserved for professional organizations like the Science Fiction Writers Association. We'll get back to them in a second. And then you vote for the next place to hold WorldCon. Heck, there are people who buy a membership in the convention, even if they're not going to go, just so that they can have a say as to where the next one is going to be. Every other year it's international. So, 1 year it's in the United States, the next year it's somewhere else in the world. It's a pretty cool setup. My initial impressions were favorable. It was a lonely place to be when you're a 39-year-old man who has nothing better to do with his life. But, I keep going back and forth as to whether or not I'm going to go over some of the other horrible things that happened at that con, and I think I'll skip them. What I am going to convey is my experience with the writing program that I paid money for. There were two judges, one of whom was a member of a pair of males who had written a novel that I'd actually written a review on my review blog. I have an opinion on almost everything. .com or the Blogspot blog. I have an opinion on almost everything. I'm not going to name the novel, but it's a variant written in the aughts on Atlas Shrugged, And I was not kind in my review of this novel, because even though the idea is a really good one, the people that the author doesn't like are cardboard cutouts, and I stand by my opinion of that novel. The other one was the other writer in this case. They were both guys, white guys. Was a short story writer that I'd never heard of. Still don't remember the name of. I looked up at the time, and he's won a few awards. Nobody you probably ever heard of. And both of these guys were members of the Science Fiction Writing Association, SFWA, which is the gold standard for science fiction writers. They set what is considered professional rate for a venue, the number of people that have to be in a venue to qualify as professional. And for a significant chunk of my writing career, membership in SFWA was what I consider to be success. Every story that you've heard in this series was at one point or another sent to SFWA qualifying venues, magazines that you've probably heard of that were famous at the time, and for the most part still are, like Science Fiction and Fantasy Magazine, Asimov, some of the other ones that are popular now didn't exist at the time, but pretty much any magazine you'd ever heard of at that time I submitted these stories to, and basically didn't go anywhere. In a couple of cases I got comments saying, hey, this is a neat idea, keep at it. The story that I submitted to this writing workshop was the story before this one, Unfood. And the feedback that I got was, to not quote exactly, because I don't remember the exact words, but I certainly remember the impression it left, was, don't quit your J job. In fact, you might want to just stop writing all around. I absolutely understand being in the mood to give harsh criticism. Sometimes I've given harsh criticism because I think it will help somebody improve. I am still open to harsh criticism. If you're a beta reader and you read one of my things and you just hate it, I would rather know than not know. But the idea that my writing career, or the career of anyone, is helped to have two white, one libertarian, one I have no fucking idea, white guys tell me that my story is so bad that I should stop writing entirely, is bordering on criminal. And I make it my policy in everything I do to support people who are being creative now in any way I can. And look, if they ask for my honest feedback and I think what they do sucks, I will still encourage them, even if I say your chances are slim and you need to work a lot more if you're going to succeed at something. But what I never tell somebody is stop writing, or stop drawing, or stop chasing your dream, because that's disgusting. Unfood, the version that you heard, I don't know if it's the version that I wrote. I think I might have done one edit pass, but it's very similar. What I do know is that I've now presented what is essentially close to the final version of every story I've ever written, and some are good and some are bad, but none of them, not one, is so bad in hindsight 10 years later that I should have stopped writing. If I'd stopped writing, I never would have written Forever West. I certainly wouldn't have written any of the short stories that are in Project NIMBY and that I'll be reading after this series. Some are questionable. I deliberately made experimental choices. Some are quite good. But because of these chuckle fucks, I am going to have imposter syndrome for the rest of my life. I could be a New York Times bestselling author at this point. And I would still question myself. It's hard enough to do what we do without absolute fucks like this being in the industry. If you ever hear of an author, especially a professional member of SFWA, telling somebody what these fucktards told me, stop patronizing them and let people know. They are very lucky that I did not deliberately look up who these guys were and tell people what they told me 10 years ago. Because they don't deserve to have another person buy another thing written by them for the rest of their lives. Toxic fucks like this do not belong in a creative industry, because it is a privilege to be able to be paid to do what you love. And to have somebody pay for feedback, and for that feedback to be so toxic that it still haunts them 11 years later, is disgusting. It is absolutely disgusting. And you can go back and see for yourself in these stories if the one that I just wrote, or any of them, is so bad that I should not have written any of the others. And if you think that, by all means, don't listen to the podcast anymore. Or feel free to keep your opinion to yourself. But you shouldn't tell anybody else ever how they're doing. Because as far as I'm concerned, feedback is good. And truth is something that I value quite a bit. But there's a difference between being an asshole because you're trying to reduce the competition in a small market that you're in, and you're playing mind games with somebody that is actually trying to improve their craft, and being a toxic fuck. Anyway, all right, so the story that you heard, Unfood in general, it was inspired when I was on a diet and was trying to lose a lot of weight. It's body horror, which is not something that I normally write. Reading it in hindsight, I'm going to probably give it a solid B. There was at one point that I thought this idea was so good that it was the best thing I'd ever written, which is why I chose it. In hindsight, that should have been Mr. Hamburger or Waiting for the Monsters to Die, which I had written at that time. But the fact of the matter is that I thought this was really good at the time I wrote it. Some of their criticism was valid, right? I even now still need to include more visual imagery and pace the story better. In certain cases, this story was deliberately set to be as long as it is to represent the struggle for the person trying to survive, because this is, at the end of the day, a man versus nature story, like Call of the Wild or Robinson Crusoe, just much, much more horrific. And frankly, the irony is, now that more time has passed, this story could be so much more horrific. Instead of saving him at the last minute to keep him from eating his own body parts, I could have gone into graphic, gory detail about that. Or I could have had the story start that way, with the cyborg being asked how he got his mechanical limbs and losing it and tearing somebody piece from piece, as they do a flashback as to why they've decided to, do this whenever somebody mentions their cybernetic parts. There's a lot of different ways I could have gone with the story, and the way I go with it is, some of their feedback was valid, which is to say it's a really good idea, but my craft, the writing itself, was weak. Now, some of it is interesting in parts, but I've written better stories in the series, for sure. None of it was so bad that I should have stopped writing. They should stop writing, right? If your idea of getting ahead is pulling other people down, then you have no business writing or drawing or doing anything else for that matter.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book Have Name Will Travel at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!